really is. So I serve as the director of donations for Picardo Farm Pea Patch in Seattle, Washington, United States. And the Pea Patch program is now turning 50 years old this year.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
it's its 50th birthday. It's very exciting. And Picardo Farm is the oldest of all the Seattle pea patches. So P is for Picardo.
Oh, and
So
tell
the
me a little bit of who's Picardo?
So Rainey Picardo was an elder gentleman gardener. The Picardo family had owned that particular piece of land just north of the University of Washington, just north of UW. They had owned a large tract of land for several generations, and as a result of the Boeing boom, they had unfortunately been priced out of the
Mm,
Seattle landscape, and so they had sold off parts of their bits and parts of their farm over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And Rainey Picardo owned the last tract, the last very large vegetable gardening, vegetable farming production inside of Seattle city limits at the time, which was right around the 1970s, we're talking. Well, right around the 1970s, Boeing, there was the United States oil crisis at the time, and there was what is now um, charmingly referred to as the Boeing bust, which means that all of the people that worked for Boeing, basically, most of them lost their jobs.
mm,
And so people were literally starving. I mean, all the folks that had come in to create what was the Boeing empire basically were out of work. And so there was this young woman named uh, named Darlin Runberg, and she was a young student at the University of Washington, and she was very inspired by Earth Day, and she was very inspired by the Back to the Land movement of the early 70s in the United States.
mm,
And so she approached Rainey Picardo, and she said, "Hey, people are starving in our neighborhood. Can we use part of your land and start a community garden?"
mm.
And Rainey agreed, and she worked with the Puget Sound um, cooperative uh, grocery store, which is now known as PCC here in Seattle. It's a big, uh, grocery store chain here in Seattle.
Yes, yes.
And so she worked with what was then PCC, and they arranged for master gardeners to come in. And then she brought in a group of school children with the idea that she would teach school children how to grow their own food for families that were literally starving
Mm.
in that particular area. And then the city council came. They were a young group of newly elected folks that came in right after the Boeing bust, and they had just been elected. And they came in after that first year of her and Rainey working together, Rainey Picardo working together, and she convinced them to break off some of the city emergency fund money to purchase that land, which was then dedicated as a community gardening space.
Mm.
And they produced so much food that first year, in that first year of community gardening, that they were able to give quite a lot of it to what was then a very newly formed idea, which was a food bank. And so they were able to then feed a lot of their neighbors fresh produce from that tract of garden.
Right.
And so it's still owned to this day by the city of Seattle. And the idea was so immediately popular that the city then purchased 10 other garden spaces the following year. And that was 1973. So it's 1974. They purchased 10 other gardening spaces. And since then, it's become thousands of gardeners across gardens in almost every neighborhood in the city of Seattle. I'm very proud of
That's
what has.
incredible. And even to this day, all of them provide food for the food bank, correct?
So all of them, many of them have, most of them have what's called giving gardens.
Mm.
And there's an entire organization here in Seattle called the Seattle Giving Garden Network. So you can look that up. The website is sggn.org.
Mhm.
And I'm on the board of directors. I serve there as well. And that is almost entirely citywide, and people grow food in order to give to their neighbors, whether that's through food banks or through community partnerships or little
Mm.
free farmers markets or however it is that people choose to give.
That is beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story. And what have you been doing since we last spoke? I think I heard you are done with school kind of thing. What have you done since our last chat?
Right. So um, let's see, how do I describe this? So I now am certified in a program that is a microbiological soil program. So
Mm.
there's a school called Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web School. I highly encourage everyone to look into it because um, as colloquial as it sounds, it is an incredible, very rigorous scientific program. And so what it is I just graduated from the very first of the foundation courses. um, they gave us a year to do it, and I managed to cram it into 3 weeks. And I highly recommend that everybody takes the year to do it because that was a mental marathon that I will never forget. So it's self-paced, but so of course I had to
Overachiever.
I had to do it as fast as possible.
You're an overachiever. That's what you are, but that's okay. That's good.
Well, nobody's got time to, waste, right? And so anyway, what that means is that I'm now going on to work. I'm going into the second phase of training, which is to do microscopy and to understand the soil microbiome better on a practical level, and then also to put all of the principles into practice in terms of creating fresh soil. And I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit more, but basically the idea is that Dr. Elaine Ingham is one of the premier soil scientists in the world. She's widely recognized as one of the leading folks that truly understand how the soil works.
Mm.
And that basically unlocks the secrets of how life works on our planet. And
Mm.
um, she goes into great detail about all of the intricacies of it, but the larger picture is that humans have really just unlocked how to speed up geologic time to rebuild the soils on our planet.
Mm.
And that basically negates all of the death and destruction that we ourselves have created as a result of our unfortunate habits, which of course is the entire conversation that we'll have. So we'll get into that more. But the hope of the story, and the reason why I'm doing this, is because there is great hope, and that is that we can rapidly speed up geologic time to reverse all of the damage that we think of when we think of what humans have done to hurt the planet. And really, the big takeaway is that there is no amount of damage that can't be fixed, and the earth heals herself very rapidly. And I'll go into case studies in just a little bit about some of the ways that the earth can heal herself very rapidly. And whether that's very large parts of the earth or just a backyard or a tiny little space, really things can be healed on a very, very quick level if you
Wow.
understand those principles behind microbiology.
Absolutely love that. I mean, I love the fact that I hear the word hope shows up when you say that we can rapidly heal the damaged soil because a lot of us are not even conscious or are making it purposeful to heal the soil. We're just using it and moving on. And so that's been the biggest fear is, we're leaving trash behind. We're trashing the planet and not allowing it to recover. And so that brings hope for me to hear that, as well as the fact that there will be ways that we can teach everyone how to rapidly heal the soils that they have around them. And that is the reason why we have this carbon footprint. How can you reduce your carbon footprint? So let's start out by talking about what different roles does soil play concerning our carbon footprint. what, in your opinion, what role does the soil play in reducing our footprint?
Well, soil is where carbon. Okay, so let's get into carbon a little bit. I'm not going to go into the entire science of it, but carbon is one of the most prolific molecular structures on the face of planet Earth. And it is also one of the most malleable. And so carbon can be used in many, many, many ways. And the natural cycle of life uses carbon. So our bodies are made out of carbon. You and I are both about 18% carbon.
Mm,
Plants are made out of carbon. So a tree, and the higher the density of the material, generally, the more carbon there is in it. So a tree can be up to 300% higher in carbon by dry mass. So a tree is about 80% carbon by dry mass.
hmm
Think about grass. So grass is, everywhere on the face of the planet. Most grasses, especially perennial grasses, if they have enough soil to grow in, their root structure, and this is true for all plants.
hmm
We usually think of plants as the above ground that we can see, and that's generally how humans operate, right? Like we think about everything that we can see. But then there's the entire life below the surface of the soil. So grasses might grow to be 6 inches, 12 inches, 3 feet, 5 feet high, but then their root structure can stretch down two or three or four or five times their
hmm
above ground height. Well, all of that root structure is made out of carbon. So everything that is an organic structure is made out of carbon.
mm,
Carbon is where we mine what we think of as combustible material or petrochemical material. So we mine that carbon out of the soil to begin with. Think about gasoline, petroleum, everything that we make plastics out of. Think about all of the ways that we use things that we mine out of the soil. All of that was held inside of the soil, and
right.
all of that was locked in there through the course of geologic time. Well, now humans are bringing it back to the surface, and then through combustion or through however they're doing it, they throw it back up into the atmosphere, right?
Mm, right.
So soil holds this huge amount of living organic biomass, and it holds an enormous amount, which is what we, have made businesses out of. Well, it holds this enormous amount of dead biomass,
Mm,
right? It's all carbon structure. Okay. Well, then everything that's living is made out of carbon. And let's think about this. In every teaspoon of healthy living soil, just talking about the microbiome, not talking about plant structures, just talking about the microbiome, there are millions upon millions of microbiological lives
mm,
that live inside of every tiny little space of
mm,
healthy living soil on the planet. So size is irrelevant. What matters is mass. And so the
mm,
mass of the microbiome across the surface of the planet, kept hidden from our eyes until very recently, inside of the soil, all of their bodies are made out of carbon.
mm,
And all of them create carbon structures that they inhabit. They also create, many of them create glues that hold themselves into organic matter, both living and dead. And those glues are made out of carbon. So there's this whole world of life that we're only just starting to approach and appreciate, that is made out of carbon inside of the soil.
mm. So how does the soil microbiome impact the carbon though?
So every body that's constructed on the planet draws carbon into itself.
Okay.
I mean, I'm talking as if we have agency, but really it's just one of those natural laws of
Natural,
nature,
right.
right? Like a baby doesn't sit around thinking about how to put carbon inside of itself, and neither does the microbiome. But through nature, carbon is brought down the out of the air or through the soil
Mhm.
from CO2 into a fixed carbon form that is a carbon structure form.
Okay.
So let's think about plants. Plants, let's think about one single blade of grass. That single blade of grass, it comes out of a seed. That seed is made out of carbon.
Mhm.
It sprouts out of that seed and it immediately starts to photosynthesize. And
Mhm.
so the miracle of photosynthesis is that that plant converts sunlight into carbon. It draws carbon into itself
Mhm.
through that
Process.
conversion process of photosynthesis. It draws carbon, CO2, into itself, into its body, and it converts it into a physical form, which
Mm.
is the form of the plant. Well, if you're thinking about, that was a blade of grass, right? A blade of grass has a lifespan of, a year, maybe less than that if the sun is hot and the roots are shallow. And
Yeah.
so let's think about a tree. So a tree starts to grow, and as it grows, the photosynthetic process starts laying down layer upon layer upon layer of carbon into that tree.
Right.
So above ground, you have the tree trunk that starts to expand. And all of that is constructed out of dense layers of carbon.
Beautiful.
Then you have all of the things that are above ground. Let's say it's a tree that loses its leaves every year. All of those leaves are made out of carbon. They all go back down into the soil. That's one of the places that the microbiological world draws carbon out of the above ground world and sinks it back down into the below ground world. That tree also has roots. So the roots may grow down twice, three times as deep or as wide as that tree. And so all of those structures that are below ground are all made out of carbon, just the same as the structure that we see that's above ground.
So, you mentioned earlier about comparing this to dead dirt. So, if we had that, we're talking about a healthy ground right now, a healthy soil. But what happens when the soil is malnutritious and dead? And the tree, you could start seeing that the trunk dries up, or from the inside out, or what is it that happens with the dead dirt? And what can we do to, as you said, rapidly reconstitute it?
So dead dirt is an important concept to understand
Mhm.
because dead dirt is basically devoid of microbiological life.
That's scary.
So that it is, and this is very hard for people to start to wrap their brains around because you cannot see what's going on. We can't see what's going on inside of the soil until very recently.
Mhm.
And you can't really see it unless you're looking at it under a microscope, even to this day.
Mm.
And so, what's going on inside of the soil is the place where life begins to happen. So, dead dirt is a place where there is no more microbiological life. And there are just a few ways that we know of that can kill the entire microbiological life of the soil.
Mm.
And they're entirely human produced. So, one of them is through toxic chemicals that we put on the soil, which can be any biocide. So the scientific word is the suffix "icide" is the same as suicide and homicide. You have herbicide and pesticide and fungicide. They're all they all mean death.
Oh.
And so anytime you have an "icide," it's killing things
Mhm.
inside of that soil
Right.
that you're putting that on, right? We know that toxic chemicals like glyphosate, Roundup, we know that, you know, any number of the toxic chemicals that we have created in order to control nature, we know that those actively don't just kill the above ground life, they kill the below ground life.
Oh.
We know that the runoff from toxic chemical production and also the runoff from things like animal agriculture that simply imbalance. So
Mm-hmm.
create more of a nitrogen bloom inside of the soil, or they create a sulfide overload inside of the soil. Even natural processes, when they're too condensed, they can create an imbalance inside of that soil. All of those things, they actively kill off the microbiology of the soil. Fire is another one. So if you have a fire that's too hot, that's on the surface of the soil, it can absolutely kill everything that's inside of that soil. And then the last place that we know that we kill the microbiome is through tilling.
Mm.
So tilling up the soil breaks up all of that life that has been working so hard to
Mm.
pull together its own little environments underneath the soil. Or you might have something like fungi that grow vast amounts, vast stretches of filamentous material underneath the soil. When you chop that up through tilling, you're actively killing everything that is working so hard below the soil
Mm.
to bring life into it, right? And we can get more into the life of, how plants work. Plants draw all of these things to themselves, and so every time you kill off plants, you're also reducing the food source of the microbiome. But then if we're going to talk about getting into the carbon cycle, again, anytime you kill off all of that life inside of the soil and you have nothing but dead dirt, you also don't have all of that active pulling in of carbon from the atmosphere that comes first from the microbiome and then in symbiosis with plants that are growing.
Oh, wonderful. So, when you were talking, everything from my picture, when I'm trying to picture everything, is the forest. If you look at the forest and you go and you see pines have fallen, leaves have fallen, trees and trunks have fallen, and nobody's tilling the forest, and the forest is thriving. And so that just reminds me about the tilling. And I do realize that I read something somewhere that you shouldn't till your garden or even your garden beds. Beds is a better way to provide nutrients to the soil than turning it. So, with that being said, how do we start soil building a proper, healthy soil?
That's a very good question. I do want to just touch on that forest thing just for a moment because
Sure, sure.
that was an important vision for you to have.
Yeah.
So just to give everybody a little understanding of what we don't yet know about the microbiome, what we do know is that in a healthy old growth forest, 75% of that forest soil is made out of fungi.
Oh,
75%. So when you think about dirt, when you think about soil, in an old growth forest where nobody has touched the soil ever for
mhm.
the entire millions, tens of millions of years that forest might have, been working on its own, 75% of that soil will be made out of mycorrhizal fungi.
Mm.
And so this is what we're trying to now uncover and understand are these relationships. And that would be a healthy soil. And all of their bodies are also made out of carbon. So you can think about if you want to visualize this, if you have, a pound of soil from an old growth forest, 75% of that will be mycorrhizal fungi. And all of that is constructed primarily out of carbon. So not just the above ground tree structures, but also the below ground things that we're just now starting to really understand. Though that's where soil starts to really you start to appreciate how much carbon there is that's locked away inside of the soil.
That's incredible. So, how do plants itself help us reduce our carbon footprint? Because we talk about carbon, everything has carbon in it. So how do we why do we say reduce carbon footprint in the first place? Why do we say that phrase? And what,
That's a
because
good
everything's
question.
carbon, right? So what's the danger about carbon and why should we reduce it?
That's a good question. So, really, we've only come to start to understand that carbon is a major greenhouse gas emission. So, if you have too much carbon dioxide in the air, which is the result of combustion, and it's also the result of respiration.
Mm.
If you have too much carbon dioxide in the air, there's not enough oxygen and humans can't breathe. So there's that.
There's that.
So,
Mm.
so there's that. Um, you also, if you have too much carbon dioxide in the air, you actively create what we think of as the greenhouse effect, which is sort of a poorly understood concept. But basically, what that means is that it's creating conditions that are too hot for humans to be able to survive. And so there are lots of different greenhouse gases. There's methane, there's all sorts of things that are floating around. But the thing to really understand is that plants have so much ability to draw down that carbon dioxide out of the air. You can look up, if you look up a year in the life of Earth by NASA. Let me just make sure I have this right. A year in the life of Earth's CO2 by NASA. If you look that up on YouTube, you can easily see they've done a good job doing a digital rendition of how the year long, you tick by day by day, week by week, month by month, and you can see the carbon dioxide emissions that are being released out into the atmosphere. Well, you watch and you see that in North America, North Africa, Europe, during the tilling season in the early spring, the plumes of carbon dioxide are just so thick and dark. It's terrifying, really, to see that. But then you watch, and as the year progresses, you see that over the course of summer, as all of that agricultural progress is being made and the plants are now starting to grow, all of a sudden, within a month, 2 months, all of that carbon dioxide has been drawn back down out of the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide, it's not, I mean, it's one of the most abundant gases in the universe, and certainly on the face of planet Earth, but plants have so much ability to draw it down into themselves
Mhm.
that if we work with plants and if we keep plants growing all the time instead of um, you know, getting rid of them, particularly through agriculture or through big building, mega cities or whatever. If we work with nature, we can actively ourselves start to draw down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
Great, great, great answer, and I love the way you explain it. And that really comes back to this conscious mindset conversation that we're having. How can you, as an individual, start reducing your carbon footprint? And of course, we start and we talk about your trash. How much trash are you sending to the trash fill? How can you reduce your trash, the amount of trash you're sending out? How can you reduce the amount of gas you're putting out by driving back and forth to work or wherever you're driving to? How can you recycle and so forth? And so one of the process of reducing your carbon footprint is through gardening. So we're going to switch over to gardening, Ava, because we have about 25 minutes, and I really want us to understand the importance of this. Reducing your carbon footprint by being sustainable through gardening is really a big deal. And so let's talk about gardening. And
Absolutely.
is growing our own food a good way to reduce our carbon footprint?
It's one of the best ways to reduce our carbon footprint. So if you walk into a grocery store, grocery stores are basically monuments to carbon footprint. So you walk into the grocery store, every single thing that you are going to buy at that grocery store has been shipped in. That shipping process is through a combustion engine of some sort, whether it's a truck or a train or a plane. It's all been shipped in. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that it's generally always, uh, you know, encased in some sort of packaging.
Mm-hmm.
So packaging has an enormous carbon footprint. Every plastic that you consume, every, petrochemical that's been exhausted in order to mass produce the food that you eat, everything is a monument to carbon footprint. The store itself is air conditioned, which is blissful on a summer day. But at the end of all things, that perfect condition of, that perfect 68 degrees that's inside of a grocery store, it's all burning fossil fuel in order to make that happen, right? So everything inside of a grocery store is going to be that monument to your consumption of carbon, right? The plants themselves have probably been produced through mass agriculture. So whether you're buying a box of Cheerios, or you're buying broccoli, or you're buying, a kombucha or whatever it is, every single thing that you're purchasing has likely been produced at some point through mass agriculture. And mass agriculture is one of the best ways to kill the planet, because you're basically creating the conditions for a perfect dead dirt desert
Okay.
as many times over as they can mine the soil for that plant or that product. They will, that's what mass agriculture is. So any amount of food that you can grow inside of your own realm, whether that's on your kitchen counter as sprouts, or on your balcony as a pot of herbs, or you have a community garden, or a community space like a church yard, or whatever you can convert. Lawns, if you can convert lawns into, any amount of lawn into food production, anything that you can do to take yourself out of that mass consumption equation and bring yourself into a more natural, immediate, no petrochemicals, no need for going and driving there and having that big box equation. Anything that you can do is going to draw carbon down, just yourself as a personal consumer. And then there's the growing of the plant itself. So the plant is actively, again, drawing down carbon into itself to create its own body. If you plant fruit trees, for example, we might think of that as a long-term investment, but the tree itself is working every single moment of every single day to draw down carbon out of the atmosphere and into its own body, and then down into the soil where it belongs.
Oh, beautiful environment.
Mm-hmm. So anybody that's done any amount of gardening is probably familiar with the fact that gardening is not easy.
Yeah,
And
the worms. The worms.
worms. Um, so talking about the difference between dead dirt and biologically complete dirt. So when you have a healthy soil, what plants do is they send down out of their photosynthetic process, they spend an enormous amount of energy sending sugars down into their roots. And those sugars are designed to draw microbiological life right up against those roots. Now, that microbiological life then creates out of its own food eating and excreting systems, it creates nutrients out of the soil. So bacteria and fungi in the soil, they actually have enzymes, and this is magical, and we're only just starting to understand this, but bacteria and fungi have enzymes that can actively take apart any organic or inorganic material in the soil and convert it into food that they then consume.
Mm-hmm.
So they can take apart rocks, they can take apart silica, they can take apart toxic chemicals, they can take apart just about any substance that we know of. Certainly, they take apart organic structures, and they create nutrients for themselves into their own bodies. Now, What you need in the soil then are predators. So those predators, which are the protozoa, the nematodes, all of those amoeba and things like that are on a microbiological level, they come along and they eat those bacteria and fungi. And then those bacteria and fungi have far more nutrients than those tiny little bodies need. And so they poop out the rest. So manure on a microscopic level is right up there against the plant root. Remember, the plant has sent out sugars to draw all of this to itself. And so that plant now has, with through the bacteria, fungi, and then the predators that eat those things, they now have nutrients right up against their root structure, and they can take that up inside of themselves. So you were asking about how to create gardens, right? So understanding these basic principles about microbiology is a good place to start. The second good place to start is to think about feeding the microbiology of your soil. So when we talk about, we often talk about teaching people how to not just be farmers, like they're not making, oats or hazelnuts or hops or apples. They're actually farming the soil. And if you farm the soil, then the plants themselves will have everything that they need to be able to grow big and strong above ground. So as a gardener, you can think about it the same way. You can think about, what can I feed the soil that will create healthy soils? Now, at this point, I'd like for anybody that's watching to look up Jake Mace, M-A-C-E, because you don't need really any spectacular understanding of the microbiome to know that, to watch this. This is just a case study. This is a guy who terraformed his backyard in the middle of the desert in Arizona. So this is dead landscape in the middle of the desert, no water, nothing. He completely terraformed just his tiny little backyard space of his house into this thriving, lush food forest that you can see from blocks away because the trees are so large, and he uses no water. And he did it all just by laying down wood chips. And he gets those wood chips for free because people that chip wood have to take that wood to a dump or to some place, and they have to pay. So if you just call them up and say, hey, wood chippers, hey, arborists that are my local tree people, instead of taking that to the dump, why don't you just bring it to my backyard, which is closer? So that's what Jake Mace, Jakemace, that's what he did in Arizona. It's a great case study of how you can just completely transform any tiny little space by understanding how to feed the soil microbiome. Now, wood chips are, as you think about the old growth forest with 75% of its soil being fungal mass, wood chips are the perfect food for fungus. And so wood chips naturally create this fungal life, which is one of the keystone species in the microbiome that then draws the rest of the microbiome to it, because it creates the food that upper level predatory microbiome needs in order to exist.
There is a place in Squim here in Washington. It's called Back to Eden. And that gentleman, he has MS. And I don't believe he can walk anymore. His MS, the last time we went to tour his garden, he was not walking very well, but he did the same thing. He only used wood chips. And of course, over years, the wood chip breaks down and provides that vital nutrient, the N and the K and the P, the P, I think NKP, all three, right? The nitrogen, the potassium, and what am I missing? The phosphorus.
Phosphorus.
So it provides that over time. Not so when you just start out with wood chips, it's going to take a couple of years to see the benefits of doing that process. But not everybody is going to put wood chips over their garden. So what other way, other than going to the store and just buying the bag that says for gardening and is good this and what do you recommend somebody just starting out gardening to do? And we're going to end with that question. Ava, because we want to finish up by talking about what you're doing with your project, and I'm excited to hear more about that. But let's just educate folks about what can they do as a new gardener to start out. And first of all, I want to mention to everyone though that the pea patches that are around, and they're not just in Seattle, they're all over the countries. You can find some in your neighborhood, and if there's not one, start one, because there is at least one master gardener in every town. I guarantee you that. I might lose a penny if I bet a penny, but I want to bet that there's a master gardener in probably every town there is in the United States. So they always want to love volunteering and educating people about soil. So we can start there, but what can we do to start out? If, like for me, I'm going to purchase a place and it is not till there's nothing, it's just a flat land. So I'm going to start out trying to find out how to start my garden. So where can I, being a newbie, I'm going to pretend I'm a newbie. What do I do to start out making my soil healthy to start out with?
That's a very good question. And every single microbiome is going to be different. So the principles are always the same throughout the world, but then every single person's particular situation is going to be different.
Mhm.
So I would recommend that you go into it as a scientist and just be an experimenter. Now, that being said, we do know that there are some really great uh, foods that you can very quickly start to build soil with. So the first food is wood chips.
Mhm.
That's the first food. The, and I should also say that water is life. And
Mhm.
so you're going to invest a certain amount of water in the beginning to make sure that the microbiological life inside of that soil has adequate water.
Mhm.
So, depending on the soil that you've inherited, you can always build it no matter what. But I would say first invest into finding whoever is closest to you that chips trees and can bring you wood chips, particularly hardwood and not and or not conifers. So conifers have a natural antimicrobial agent, and it's just best to avoid those. But whatever. It'll all break down within a couple years, within 2 or 3 years, if you keep it wet enough.
Mhm.
So then the second thing that you can buy, that you can find or source, is if you're close to anyone that has any amount of animals, look for people that have goats, and look for people that have rabbits, and look for people that have chickens. So those are fairly easy ways to start laying down a foundation that will start to build the microbiome. If you add manure from animals, particularly the smaller animals, and particularly those that have really hard pellets, like goats and rabbits. Those are
Mhm.
generally really safe to use on a garden. Chickens are a little bit they need a little bit of time. You have to like put this stuff in a pile, their manure in a pile, and let it sit for 6 months or a year, depending on how much rain you have. But animals that have like pellets as manure, like goats and rabbits or deer or something like that, those are generally really safe to use right away on your soil. And that just adds microbiology to your soil right away. So
Mhm.
you can just dig that right into the surface.
Good.
And then the other thing that you need is you need a source of dry carbon. So things like straw,
Mhm.
like if you're around somebody that has animals and they have bedding straw that they're throwing out, that's a perfect mix to throw on top of your garden, especially if you're just starting out, because all of that will mellow with age and it will also just bring the microbiome down right into your soil. And then the other thing to think about is to think about the plants that you're going to plant first. So the plants that you want to plant first you want to clear. So we talked about tilling and how terrible tilling is, but when you're first starting out as a gardener, you don't have a lot of time to mess around. or as a farmer, really, you don't have a lot of time to mess around. So getting rid of the invasive plants right away and just wiping them out and keeping boundaries around your invasive plant species. So going and identifying what are the things that are going to compete
Mhm.
with what I'm trying to grow, or the things that are going to make my life miserable if they stick around, right? So, like where I grew up, there was poison oak. You want to get rid of that poison oak or that poison ivy right away, because you're never going to want to touch that ground again if you make conditions where that plant is going to thrive,
Mm.
right? So you just want to go in and get rid of all of the invasive stuff, even if that means ripping up the soil completely. The soil will be fine. Like if you go and then you heal the soil afterwards, getting rid of those invasive plants just means that you as a human have the habitat to continue, with a successful venture instead of like constantly battling chaos, right? So go in, get rid of all the invasive plants, then go in, put down a layer of manure or a layer of whatever you can find that's like a high nitrogen based. You can look that up on the internet. High nitrogen based, that's coffee grounds or green leaves or grass or whatever. And then put down a layer of brown stuff, and then start to grow some plants that are what we call cover crops.
Mhm.
So cover crops will ensure that there's lots and lots of roots inside of that soil that then start to actively build your particular microbiome inside of that soil. And they'll also repel all of the problem plants that you don't want. So things like peas or beans or clover or something that's self-seeding, that's a native that would not compete with your plants because their root systems are really shallow, or they have a nitrogen fixing property, which is a useful property to have in your soil. Um, and then the other principle to really remember is that nature loves diversity. And so if you go into a new environment and you start looking around and you say, okay, I want to get rid of all the invasives. That's my first chore. That's the only big chore that I have. And then I'm going to put down stuff that's going to actively build the soil and layer it. So you layer nitrogen, you layer carbon. So it's green stuff, brown stuff. And then you plant things on top of that. Add another, maybe another layer of wood chips or something that will hold that all in. You plant some really, what you're looking for is you're looking for the tough cover crops that will seed themselves. So you only have to purchase that seed once. So you're looking for things like clover. You're looking for things like a native grass species that's going to be easy to remove later, that doesn't have runner roots or something that gnarly that's just going to take over. You're looking for cover crops to put down. So that would be my first. If you're starting from nothing, that would be my best
Absolutely.
blanket advice
Well,
for how
Ava,
to
I
start a
think we
garden.
talked a lot. We talked about the soil. Well, we started out talking about carbon and how carbon exists and how it exists in all living creatures, even also the dead rocks. It's just dead carbon. But we talked about the carbon itself and how how essential it is to our life, and how the runoff of our breath is carbon dioxide, and how we want to reduce that version of a carbon footprint that's going on around the world, using reduction of the way we travel, the way we garden, the way we also bring more trees and shrubs in our lives. And so we're going to end right now. We talk, and also we ended by talking about gardening, but we're going to end this podcast talking about your project. And I'm excited to talk about it because it is for the community, as everything that you've been talking about, the pea patch and what you do for the city of Seattle. We thank you. Has been of service. So here you go again, doing yet another project that's of service, and we all know that being of service is one of the highest vibrations you can live at. So I'm sure you're feeling good and vibrant about this project. So tell us about it without further ado.
Well, the Pea Patch program, like I said at the very beginning, has been around for 50 years, and it started out with the intention of teaching people how to grow their own food so that they wouldn't starve in the middle of an economic downturn in an urban area. And it is still going strong with that mission to this day.
Mm,
And Picardo very proudly has had a very long tradition of growing food to donate to other people. Well, so here in Seattle, painful, we had a very painful period of 2 years of people being in complete lockdown, 2 full years. And so that meant that a lot of businesses, unfortunately, went under. A lot of people's lives were ruined. A lot of people to this day have not recovered. And so there's a lot of not only hunger, but malnourishment because people couldn't even go out. So a lot of our elders that are in elder retirement communities, a lot of young people that are in that were isolated and didn't go to school, a lot of people that relied on public institutions to be able to live their day-to-day lives couldn't access those things for 2 full years.
mm,
And so Picardo, uh, I, we used to give food to food banks, and food banks are a wonderful thing. And if you don't have one in your area, I highly encourage you to consider advocating for one because they're a very useful part of the food chain for folks that don't have enough resource to go out and just purchase their own food. But um, they're very limited in a lot of ways. And so one of the ways is that if you throw a bunch of food into a food bank and it's fresh food, let's say your plum tree just had a bunch of plums, and so you throw 3 boxes of plums into your local food bank. Well, that plum season is the exact same plum season as all of your neighbors. And if they're good enough in their hearts to give their plums to a food bank, all of a sudden that food bank has so many fruit that they can never give it away. And so food banks often, and that happens with lots of different things, right? So food banks often have way too much of one thing
mm.
all at the same time. Bean season comes into season, and all of a sudden there's hundreds of pounds of beans that everybody's throwing at a food bank. So I thought to myself, well, we can do one better. So we can do one better, both by all of the gardeners that work so hard to create this beautiful organic food produce that we create in our pea patch programs. And we can also do better by the folks on the receiving end by not forcing them to go stand in a line somewhere out in the elements in an institution and make them travel to go to a box where they stand in line and they have to like wait for food and they have to, maybe get, like, what are you going to do? You're going to carry home 2 bags of what? You're going to carry home bread, meat, and cereal, and like maybe a few like prepared foods, right? Or frozen things. That's what you're going to do in the economy of a food bank. But if you can just drive produce straight to your neighbor, for some reason this is a revolutionary idea, but we just thought to ourselves at Picardo, we thought, why don't we just we're already driving this produce somewhere anyway. Why don't we just drive it to our neighbors that we know they need it? And we know they have kitchens where they can cook it. We know they have, a space where, they can prepare it. So we created partnerships. We created partnerships with our neighbors. And we have 3 community partnerships now that we donate to once per week each. So we work with a residential care facility that is for low income elders. We work with a local mosque that is primarily attended by folks that are recent immigrants from North Africa, and we work with a relocation community that has over 800 residents that's within 10 minutes driving of us. They're our immediate neighbors, but they're all women and children that are relocated from domestic abuse shelters around Seattle. So what we do is we just simply drive our produce to them once a week. We put it out on tables. It becomes like a little free farmers market. So it becomes this beautiful farmers market atmosphere. There's flowers that people donate from our garden, and lots of produce. Last year, we donated over 2,000 pounds of produce to our community partnerships. And this year, we hope to at least double that because we have a lot more space as a result of a big renovation project that we did inside of our own garden. But we now just drive produce directly to our neighbors. And what that does is it creates this beautiful community hospitality environment. So instead of just throwing our food into charity locations, we now donate directly to our neighbors, which then creates the opportunity for hospitality. So this year now we've set aside a part of our garden, and we're actually actively inviting people in for work parties that are from our donations partnerships. And a lot of people, as a result of seeing the abundance that they got last year, a lot of them are now inspired to start gardening for themselves. And so many of them are going to start coming in and learning how to grow their own produce and learn how to take care of themselves wherever it is that they are in their lives.
Beautiful. It is a responsibility that we should all take on. We should all actively take on. And so, Ava and I want to encourage you to find ways that you can participate in, even if you have to do it in pots and you don't have a garden, or because if you just have an apartment, that's not an excuse anymore. There are patches around in your town that does rent out little spaces for gardening, or just do hydroponics or do pot gardening. So there are many, many ways for you to participate in you reducing your carbon footprint. So I want to say
May I say one word about that, Letha?
yeah.
Anywhere in your town where somebody's already spending money to make a lawn, you could be growing food. So
Mhm.
just think about that. If there's somebody in your town, a community center, a church, your local courthouse, anywhere where there's libraries, anywhere where there's a lawn that surrounds that and somebody's using water to create a lawn, you can go to them as a taxpayer, as a citizen, you can go to them and say, I would like to make part of this into a garden to grow food. And just keep asking until you find somebody that says yes.
That's beautiful, beautiful. Without further ado, I'm going to leave this last few minutes to Ava. Ava, if you had one thing to say, or not one thing, but one further advice that you want to give everyone, what would that be?
My advice would be to start considering the fact that when you go to the grocery store is a monument to a carbon footprint. If you had a perfect museum housed full of carbon footprint, it would be a grocery store. And so start to think about purchasing things from farmers markets, or purchasing things from your local tienda, or from your local corner grocery, your local, whoever is, whatever is the place where the locals go to buy food that's been created right there in front of you or right there in your own neighborhood. Start considering doing that, because everything that you can do to not purchase those things that have been brought from halfway around the world, or those things that were made in an industrial scale agriculture environment, everything that you can do to invest any dollar that you have into more local, particularly hyper local production of food, that is the greatest reduction of carbon footprint anybody could ever have. Everybody has to eat every day. And so, what we put in our mouths is the greatest investment of our dollars and our energy that we could possibly think of. And I want to take a lesson from the microbiome. So the microbiome contains more carbon than any other thing on the face of the planet, and we're only just beginning to understand it. So the microbiome of healthy soil has more carbon sequestered into it than any large rainforest that happens to be on top of the ground. But they're microbial, so you can't even see them. So any one particular organism's contribution is so minuscule that it's just laughable, the idea that it could possibly be the solution. But
Mm.
when you take it as a whole and you think about how everything contributes together through these tiny, tiny, tiny little things, that that aggregate, that collective power is far greater than any one of those tiny little lives' powers. So think about the power of your life not as you making that decision, but as you being capable of being part of the bigger change that needs to happen, that will be capable of reducing humanity's carbon footprint. And it does start with you. So you as a human being with your spare time, if you watch television, you've got plenty of time to go out and find somewhere to garden.
Mm.
Take your favorite show and ditch it for a month and just go and plant some things, like really, like you do have the ability to go out and change the world with your tiny little actions. So I would encourage you all to just believe that if you yourself start to do something, that adds up over the course of many, many, many people doing it.
Well, thank you, Ava, and thank you everyone for watching this. This has been filled with a lot of educational material. Pause, take notes, go back, rewind, or share with your friends and loved ones who want to learn about reducing their carbon footprint, but do participate in that community portion where we're sharing this information for you and to you. So share it with everybody that can and want to participate in reducing our carbon footprint. Ava, thank you so much for coming on. And to everyone, be safe.